You're here to tell me we don't get to hide.
Is that it?
You need time. Stay away. But time by itself, he's nothing.
You're here to tell me we don't get to hide.
Is that it?
You didn't just
And while
come
that
here
might
for
be
me.
true somewhat, I feel like Stanley also, after having been, you know, sick and hungry and being shot at in the jungle for a year,
I don't know why, but my computer just booted up like 20 World of Warcrafts, and I'm like confused. I'm so fucking confused how that even happened. But alright, whatever.
Darling, take Alexis and escape through that gap. I can hear it.
The drawing from the book Spider's Nightmare.
that mad bear's gone now, right? I was on my way to Heinmach, but got lost, and then, please, let me give you a little...
You found my hammer! I expected nothing less from the great Khazan. Now I can make whatever you need. you to bringing. Check out the don't.
Did you know Kazumake?
Finally made it. You're an ins.
Did you know?
Thanks.
doesn't want to be there anymore. The forward column initially consisted of 389 men, and by the time they made it to Bashaw, there was only 169 of them left. Either way, it doesn't matter for now because Stanley doesn't have the resources to go back all the way they just came. So he has to spend nearly another year there going to local forts and putting together more soldiers. Now you would think, wouldn't he have more people on the rear column to help with this supply thing? Again, we'll get to what happened to them. But Stanley wouldn't have enough resources to make the trek back until April of 1889. And at that point, Bashaw still didn't want to go. So on April the 5th, the two had a very heated argument where Stanley said he is leaving April 10th with or without Bashaw. So on April 10th, Stanley leaves and Bashaw comes with him. Again, taking nearly a year once more to get back out. Although this time they pass through various other European territories that help them out on the way. Also, to add to the absurdity of this whole thing, in December of 1889, the group was in a German territory, and apparently the Germans had a big banquet for them while they were there, and during the banquet, Bashaw got so drunk that he fell out of a window and nearly died. Could you imagine? Like they spent 3 years trying to get this guy, and then he died in a German territory in Africa because he fell out a window. Eventually, the forward column meets up with what remained of the rear column, and everyone returned to Europe in 1890. Stanley wrote a book about his experience called In Darkest Africa. The book was a bestseller, the men were acclaimed as heroes, and all was well for a while. See, like I said, a lot of people died on the expedition, and it wasn't just the local workers, some of them were European officers and officials. So a lot of people had questions as to what happened in Africa. More specifically, what happened to the rear column? See, the rear column was left in the command of someone named Edmund Barttelot. Barttelot was a former British Army officer and was left over the rear column to take care of the supplies. Well, when Stanley got back to Europe, all that he wrote in his book was that Barttelot had been shot, and James Jameson, who was also left in the rear column, had died of illness. As you could imagine, this explanation wasn't good enough for a lot of people. They naturally wanted to know what went so wrong, but anytime he was asked, Stanley seemed hesitant on the matter. A few European survivors of the rear column, men like William Bonney, had told Stanley what they had witnessed, and Stanley, very purposefully, didn't say what he heard in the book. Well, after enough journalists came asking, eventually, in 1890, Stanley broke his silence. The first major statement of his being published in the Times on November 8th of 1890. See, everyone thought perhaps Stanley was hiding some tale of heroism from the two men that would overshadow his own, or perhaps some tale of failure on his part that led to the men's death. But what Stanley was actually doing was trying to preserve their image, one that was inevitably shattered when the truth came out. It seems that, as corroborated by many of the survivors, things went wrong for the rear column almost immediately. The plan was they would stay behind with the supplies, and then Tipu Tip would get a line of couriers, or at least Stanley referred to them as couriers in his book. In reality, they were just slaves. Tip would have slaves create a supply line for them so that they could continue forward. Well, there was a miscommunication regarding what Tip needed. He was going to trade with slave traders he knew in the region to make a supply line to the front. However, these traders were only interested in trading ammunition that Stanley's forward column had taken with them. So with no means of establishing a supply line, Tip just left, meaning the whole rear column was to sit around awaiting further orders. In the first several months, the rear column ran low on food, and as mentioned, several of the locals didn't want to trade with them. So, in desperation, members of the rear column began kidnapping people from local villages and holding them as ransom in order to get food and supplies. As this was happening, they were periodically attacked and disease began to set in. It's not known exactly how many died because several deserted once they realized things were going bad. This in combination with the fact they hadn't heard from Stanley's forward column in some time. For all they knew, those guys were dead too. But what we do know is out of the over 300 who were left in the rear column, only double-digit numbers remained. From the account Stanley echoed, Barttelot began to lose it. According to Stanley, it sounds that Barttelot began to sow discourse among the men, saying things like, "Why do you think Stanley always returns from Africa alone?" implying that their leader had brought them out there to kill them. According to Stanley's November 8th statement, quote, "I was told that Major Barttelot's life was saved twice by Mr. Bonney. Once when Major Barttelot had suddenly seized a woman and fastened his teeth in her shoulder. I was told that frequently Major Bartolot would cause his black followers to shrink before him by standing in their path in front of the advancing natives and grinning like a fiend. That's the expression that was used. I was told that with a steel-pointed cypress staff, he had run about the camp prodding his people with it, and then flourishing the stick and hitting about him indiscriminately. He goes on to describe one instance in which a 10-year-old boy, who before Bartolot seemed to take a liking to, was kicked so hard by Bartolot that he died. He became militaristic, punishing people under his command for the slightest infraction, having public canings and whippings amongst the men. As you could imagine, this made the numbers decrease further as more people began to desert. According to Stanley, at one point deserters from the front column made their way back to the rear column, and someone told Bartolot that Stanley had been killed, to which Bartolot replied, "Thank God, I shall be made a colonel now." Bartolot began to write in his journal about how the other men were plotting against him, how they were doing things wrong. Another quote from Stanley, "At one time, Major Bartolot got into such a crazed condition of mind that he asked to retire from the expedition, and he asked Mr. Bonney for a medical certificate, saying as he did so, 'Don't you think I'm sick enough to go home?'" Until finally, Stanley describes how Bartolot died. After keeping the camp in a state of disarray for days on end, Stanley says, "At dawn, Major Bartolot heard some drumming and singing outside his cabin. He sent some Sudani soldiers to try and stop the noise, and afterwards he sent a little boy to them. Their threatening messages produced no effect, however. Finally, Major Bartolot went himself, taking in his hand a loaded revolver and the steel-pointed cypress staff, with which he had already done such mischief. With these weapons in his hands, he walked to the scene of the singing and the drumming, and there he saw a woman beating a drum, accompanying the music with her voice in the usual habit of the Manyuma, who thus start the day at dawn with wild music. Major Bartolot, seeing the woman, ordered her to desist 2 or 3 times, accompanying each order with a prod with his steel-pointed staff or a blow with it. He then began to kick her, upon which her husband, Songa, hearing the screams and seeing Bartolot armed with a revolver, thrust his gun through a loophole in a hut opposite the officer and shot him dead. Bartolot was shot by the husband of the woman he was beating. And tragically, the husband, according to Stanley, was executed just a couple days later. After saying this and then discussing why he kept it out of the original book, Stanley raises this point. "I have censored the whole of the rear guard, and if a sufficient explanation is not found in the foregoing of why I censored them, it is necessary to understand that any of these officers could, with a little firmness, have arrested Major Bartolot's proceedings without violence. A mere letter from any one of them protesting against such acts as I have described and threatening to report them to the Amin Pasha Relief Committee at home would have stopped those acts. This must be clear from the many accounts given, and even from Lieutenant Traup's own narrative, that they disagreed with many things Major Bartolot did." So Bartolot was a man who was given power and abused it thoroughly, ultimately being killed by the very people he abused. So if that guy was in charge of the rear column, you can see why things fell apart. But that's not the story that everyone remembers from the rear column. That's not the story everyone remembers from this expedition. It's the one this video is titled after, the Jameson Cannibal Affair. Keep in mind, James Jameson was a beloved person back home. He came from a wealthy family, went out and charted the world. So when the Times journalist who was interviewing Stanley on the November 8th edition said this, it was a shock to many. Mr. Jameson is accused specifically of standing by while a young girl whom he had purchased for the purpose was deliberately murdered in order that he might be an eyewitness of an act of cannibalism and record the ghastly scene in his sketchbook. Both these men are dead and can no longer answer for themselves. No one would willingly believe statements which, if true, would cover their memory with infamy. It becomes necessary, therefore, to scrutinize very closely the evidence on which such statements rest. Mr. Stanley, of course, believes them or he would not repeat them, and it must be acknowledged that he has only very reluctantly broken silence on the subject. But when the evidence he advances is examined, it amounts in the majority of cases to little more than a repetition of the words, "I was told." This, of course, is sound prima facie evidence, but it is not necessarily conclusive. Much of the following information, says Mr. Stanley, I obtained from Mr. Bonney, the Zanzibaris, the Arabs, and the Manyuma. So Stanley says that James Jameson, the beloved heir to Jameson Irish whiskey, bought a slave in order to watch her be cannibalized. You can hear in the following words how the writer for this article is almost aghast at what he's hearing. Not necessarily calling Stanley a liar, but implying this can't be true. So where does this report come in the first place? Well, there were a few people who bore witness to this cannibalistic act. But the most whole account, and the first one we get in detail, is that of Jameson's interpreter.
Granger knows that if you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, you go to great lengths, and sometimes heights, to ensure the power is always flowing. Which is why you can count on Granger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRANGER, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
Assad Farhan followed Jameson around and again acted as his interpreter to the locals. Farhan was the one who began talking about this story after it first happened and reported it to the rest of the rear column that eventually made its way up to some of the front column. These were the reports that Stanley had heard about while in Africa and decided to omit from his book. Well, after Stanley came out with his report on November 8th in the Times, Farhan would come out with his own statement only 6 days later in the New York Times. Or at least the New York Times would publish his affidavit. So we need some background as to when this exact moment took place. According to the story, at several points, Jameson tried to regain contact with Tipu Tip. Jameson would go to him and try to get more couriers so that they can get the supply lines going. Every time Tipu would ask for exorbitant amounts of money that Jameson didn't have. Because keep in mind, Tip left the expedition on their own, but he was still doing business around the area. So if Jameson knew where Tip was, he would try to go find him. Well, it was supposedly while Tip was doing business with the Reba tribe, a group that was around what is now the Lokandu community. While at this tribe, Jameson was with Tipu witnessing a festival. And at this festival, according to Farhan, this happened. Jameson expressed to Tipu's interpreter curiosity to witness cannibalism. Tipu consulted with the chiefs and told Jameson he had better purchase a slave. Jameson asked the price and paid 6 handkerchiefs. A man returned a few minutes afterward with a 10-year-old girl. Tipu and the chiefs ordered the girl to be taken to the native huts. Jameson himself, Salim, Masandi, and Farhani, Jameson's servant, presented to him by Tipu, and many others followed. The man who had brought the girl said to the cannibals, "This is a present from a white man who desires to see her eaten." The girl was tied to a tree, says Farhan. The natives sharpening their knives the while. One of them then stabbed her twice in the belly. She did not scream, but knew what would happen, looking to the right and left for help. When stabbed, she fell dead. The natives cut pieces from her body. Jameson, in the meantime, made rough sketches of the horrible scenes. Then we all returned to the chief's house. Jameson afterward went to his tent, where he finished his sketches in watercolors. There were 6 of them, all neatly done. The first sketch was of the girl as she was led to the tree. The second showed her stabbed, the blood gushing from the wounds. The third showed her dissected. The 4th, 5th, and 6th showed men carrying off the various parts of the body. Jameson showed these and many other sketches to all the chiefs. This, of course, is a level of evil and depravity that's hard to comprehend. I mean, we hear about things like serial killers or family murderers, but even with monsters like that, there's something comforting in the idea they have to hide it. Even if they don't feel guilt or that they've done wrong, they know they can't let others know that they do wrong. But something this wicked, that it's out in the open and you not only witness it and cause it, but you draw pictures of it, you document it. It's a depravity that's hard to put into words. And this seems to be the story that Stanley heard of and omitted from his original book, but now has gone public with. So what is this then? Just 2 men from an expedition who went mad and acted on their worst impulses, doing the very worst they could with their time before their time was up? Most likely, yes. But when it comes to Jameson's account, there's some speculation. See, this was published November 14th. In the midst of all this coming out about Jameson, Jameson's widowed wife was doing everything she could to save his reputation. She publicly criticized Stanley's account, and as soon as this went up in the New York Times, the next day, her own statement went up. As mentioned, Jameson became ill and died in the Congo. Well, according to her, 2 nights before he died, he sent this telegram. See, the world at large didn't know about this cannibal story yet, but within the expedition, People were talking about it. So according to her, this was sent to Sir William McKinnon, one of the men within the expedition, and amongst the expedition to clear his name, according to his wife, Jameson said this: "Upon arrival at Ribaruba, the chief invited me to his residence, where I witnessed a curious native dance following other ceremonies, which Tipu said was usually followed by a cannibal feast. I laughed skeptically, whereupon another Arab described a horrible story. I flatly declared that it was impossible that this could happen. The Arab reported, 'Give me a bit of cloth and see.' I thought this a mere ruse to obtain a gift, but the Arab had formerly been kind, so I gave him a piece of 6 handkerchiefs. Then followed the most horrible